Hello, everyone. Welcome to the History of Oil lecture on the causes of World War II. This is your instructor, Mr. Gotro. How are you today? We got a few people here today, but then we're going to see. Okay, that went off. Okay. Talking about the cause of World War II. Monday, the midterm grades were due. I want you to remember something, that the midterm grades are not a permanent part of your transcript. So if you're not doing well, I don't think I had anybody that was doing very badly. If you're not doing well, that just means we've got to kick it up a notch, okay? From here on in until the final, there will be only one attempt at every test, not two, one attempt at every test. And please try to make every test on time so that you make it before the closing. All the other problems have probably been separated out of, let me know if you can hear me through this broadcast, by the way. They have been going quite well. Someone contacted me about a grade that they got, and when I checked the grade, it wasn't what they said it was. It was actually higher than they said it was, so I didn't understand the discrepancy. I don't know how somebody could have mistaken that when they did. Remember, at the end of the semester, I'll drop the lowest grade so that so that way if you had missed a test or if you had got a low grade on a test, that'll be dropped in your final average. It's going to be straight averaging with the tests and the final exam. Normally, the final exam's worth 30%, tests are worth 50%, and attendance is 20%. But attendance has been pretty hard to keep. Well, thank you very much there. Who is that? Rashad, thank you very much. So let me put it to you another way. I very seldom have students that fail. Very seldom. Maybe one every year. Sometimes, and it's not from any lack of effort on my part, because I kind of bend over backwards for students. If they have a problem, I'll help them out as much as I can. If I see they have a grade missing, I'll go, okay, well, I'll let you take the test, but you'll take them 5 or 10 points off. So don't let it be said that I don't give students a chance. Okay, no problem. Who is that? Is that Cameron? All right. Sometimes it might be too loud. All right. So today we're going to talk about the cause of World War II. In the history of oil, we have to realize when the 20th century turned, oil became more important. I think you've seen that with the struggle to find it, the struggle to refine it, the struggle to make gasoline out of it. World War II was no different. World War I was just a taste of it. World War II, it was a little bit more intense because it became a part of the military strategy. So what I wanted to do was cover the causes of World War II today, and then next week we'll go ahead and do the regular PowerPoint on World War II and oil. But I am going to mention some of it now because the causes of World War II are steeped in World War I. So I wanted to tell you that. Is everybody getting a hold of all the PowerPoints that I'm putting up and everything? Because I'm putting everything up there as I use them. If I come across an article that has anything to do with what we have to do, I'll put it up there, because I don't use the textbook. The textbook that was recommended for this course is over 700 pages long. I don't know about you, but I don't have time to read a 700-page book. Okay? I don't know everything, all right, especially in the history of oil. I know how it coincides with different events that occurred in history, but I didn't see the need to read a book that long, especially when a lot of the information you're going to get is going to be from me anyway, and I'm the historian. Okay, Bradley's here. How many is that? I don't see how many that is. Am I still broadcast? Oh, 10. Okay, so I'm still broadcasting. Okay, so let's get started, because I don't want to keep y'all, all afternoon. I have a lecture this afternoon at 4, and I have a radio interview I have to do. Somebody called me, wants to talk to me on the radio about something. So, the causes of World War II. Now, the road to war actually began after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. Let me give you a brief rundown if I didn't already. World War I started as basically a bunch of bullies on the block. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was, was the grandson of Queen Elizabeth. He was also the cousin of George V and Nicholas II. And what was going on is the monarchies were losing their power. Kaiser Wilhelm had built this huge navy in competition with George V of England, because he wanted to show his cousins up, is basically was what it was. And I use this term, and I hope I don't offend anybody. It's very incestuous power in those days. Everybody was related to this one or related to that one. Excuse me. Weather change, allergies. So when we look at the causes of World War II, they're rooted in the causes of World War I. That war never really ended, per se. There was an armistice, which was a ceasefire in 1919 called the Treaty of Versailles, and it basically punished Germany. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to it. But the road to war actually went through the Versailles Treaty. And what the Versailles Treaty did was it organized, and Woodrow Wilson, our president, was instrumental in it. He introduced what was called the 14 points. And basically it was about self-determination. Each nation that wanted to govern themselves, they could, and the world powers would let them do it. Well, in Germany, prior to the end of the war, Kaiser Wilhelm had abdicated the throne, which means he gave it up and fled Germany to live in Holland, where he died in 1941. Well, in Germany, it left this great power vacuum, this great political power vacuum. Some people wanted to return to the monarchy, and others wanted a new form of government. So you see these other ideologies start to rise. There were the Spartacists, there was the Weimar Republic, which was supposed to be a democracy, but it didn't work out that way. There were several failures in that government. In the Versailles Treaty, the Germans had to, it was called the War Guilt Clause. It was Article 231. And in that War Guilt Clause, Germany had to accept responsibility, total responsibility for the war, even though they were not the first nation to declare war. Austria-Hungary was the first nation to declare war after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June, 1914. Well, at the end of the war, I mean, this was a devastating war. It was an artillery war, basically, and there were new weapons: the airplane, the machine gun, poisonous gas. Later on, they would outlaw poisonous gas in warfare, but Hitler still used it in the gas chambers against the Jews in World War II. But I'm getting a little past myself here. So Germany, under the War Guilt Clause, had to first of all admit guilt for total destruction for the war. Number two, they had to pay for it, $33 billion. Now, this is 1919. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And they had to give up their armed forces. They had to get their armed forces down to 100,000 men, and that's not easy from an army that was once 6 million men down to 100,000. And they had to give up all their weapons of war, which included their navy. So they had to sink all their ships. And they sailed them, including the U-boats, which were very effective during World War I. They had to sink those at Scapa Flow in England. And they had to get rid of all of that. Germany was very bitter at the end of the war because they said, well, we didn't start the war, we executed our plan. Well, number one, the first thing they did wrong in World War I is that Germany violated the neutrality of Belgium. Belgium was neutral. They didn't take either side, but in order to execute their plan, which was known as the Schlieffen Plan, they went through Belgium and violated their neutrality. Well, in World War II, they would do the same thing and violate Belgian neutrality because the Nazis didn't care. They were bullies and they were brutes, okay, and they were superior at that time. In fact, they thought they were superior at that time. As far as Italy was concerned, Italy did not get what she wanted in World War I, at the Treaty of Versailles. So she walked out of the meetings. Now, Japan is an interesting case. Japan fought on the War of the Allies. And during the war in 1916, the German foreign minister to the United States, a guy by the name of Arthur Zimmerman, wrote a telegram to the Mexico. And he told Mexico, he said, look, if you join the war, now this is before the United States actually went into the war. If you join the war with us against the United States, we'll give you back California, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. But there was one other thing in the Zimmerman telegram that Arthur Zimmerman wanted the Mexican government to do, and that was to go to Japan and tell Japan, look, Why don't you come join the war on our side? And Japan resisted. And I think they regretted it, because when they went to the Paris peace talks, which eventually formulated the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese wanted a resolution put into the Treaty of Versailles stating that Asian people were equal to whites. Woodrow Wilson told them no. And the reason why Woodrow Wilson told them no is because he was a racist. He was a racist. And it was plain and simple. It was all out in the open. And I'll give you an example. In 1915, there was a movie that came out. Of course, it was a silent movie back then. It was called Birth of a Nation. And it was based upon a book called The Klansman, and a Ku Klux Klansman. And it portrayed black men as brutes, and just, it was disgusting. And it was first screened at the White House in 1915. And what they did back in silent movies is they used to play music. Somebody would beat a piano or an organ and play music while the movie was going on, so you'd have some sound. And if there was dialogue, the dialogue would come up like a flashcard on the screen. Okay? Well, after the film was over, Woodrow Wilson was asked by a newspaper reporter, what did you think of the movie, Mr. President? He said, that was the finest motion picture I've ever seen. So that gives you a general look into Woodrow Wilson's white supremacy backgrounds. In fact, he was from Virginia. He was from Virginia, and then he went to Princeton and became a professor. And then I believe he was governor of New York, and then he became president of the United States. But he was a progressive type of leader. Now, what does a progressive leader mean? That means that you make up rules as you go along sometimes, and you do things very quickly. You don't think meticulously as to what the effects are going to be. You just do it. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes things have to be changed differently. But at Versailles, every nation signed the Treaty of Versailles except the United States. The Congress would not ratify it. We were the only nation that didn't ratify it, so we were not a member of the Treaty of Versailles. And we're going to talk about the League of Nations a little bit later, because it was because of the weakness of that organization that gave rise to Adolf Hitler. The League, the League of Nations was supposed to settle arguments diplomatically and remove warfare from the equation. So, I didn't eat anything today. I don't know what. They're supposed to remove warfare away from any type of negotiations and bring in diplomacy. Well, when you have people that are very aggressive, specifically the Japanese, who leave the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris peace talks literally just ticked off because they've been told, oh, well, you're not equal to white people. Well, we're going to show you. The League of Nations was weak for one main reason, and if you want to, you need to write this down, because you will be tested on this. I will ask this question. The reason why the League of Nations was weak is because they had no military force to back up any resolutions that they made. It was just, don't do that again. Well, if you don't have a military force to back it up, nobody's going to take you seriously. There were members who were expelled or otherwise left the organization, mostly North Africa and Luxembourg, one in Europe, and a few others. But the problem was that the one power that was involved in defeating the Germans never joined, and that was the United States. So it was basically just a matter of time. And I'll give you for instance, General John Pershing, who was the general in charge of the American, what they call Expeditionary Force, American troops in Europe during World War I, near the end of the war, said, if we go through with this peace, the Germans are never going to realize that they were beaten. We have to beat them militarily, or else we're going to have to come back and do this again. And he was right, because we didn't beat them militarily. Their own citizens said, enough of the war, bring them home. They had all these shortages. Everything went to the army first. The meat went to the army. They had turnips for the citizens had nothing but turnips. There were people slaughtering horses and dogs on the street to eat for meat. So the German people were tired of it. So when this League of Nations came up, it was basically supposed to be a policing organization so that nations would not go to war over stupid little reasons, which they thought was World War One had done. So that was their main weakness. The other weakness was that they were not organized. They were really not organized. This is an idea that came up, that Woodrow Wilson came up with, that didn't work. He spent the rest of his life, he died of a stroke in 1924, trying to get people to realize that the League of Nations was the way to go. Well, it hasn't been the way to go. We have also found out over the last 65 years that the United Nations ain't the way to go either. All right? It's simply just a rigged balance of power, in other words. The ineffectiveness of the League of Nations was no control over major conflicts, had no progress in disarmament, and no effective military force. So if you cannot control how military armament, that is how weapons are made, how many weapons you can make, then you don't stand a chance at controlling whether another war breaks out. And in between that, the Japanese embarked on a campaign of conquest in Asia, which would eventually lead to the attack at Pearl Harbor in 1941. Now, one of the soldiers that was really dissatisfied with what happened is this guy right here. You know who that is? I'm going to wait for y'all to answer, see if y'all paying attention. This guy right here, do y'all know who he is? Anybody? Wake up. Somebody tell me who that is. Yes, sir. Thank you, Austin. That is Adolf Hitler. At the end of the war, you get 5 points, Austin. Thank you very much. Oh, Jerry, you get 2. Sorry. I mean, you came in after. Oh, no, he's not Russian. That's Adolf Hitler right there. That's before he shaved his mustache off. He was a decorated German soldier in World War I. Won the Iron Cross second class, which was an award for bravery. He was wounded twice. Once in the... No, it's not Joseph Mengele. My God. Yeah. He didn't have a mustache till after the war. Adolf Hitler was a decorated soldier in World War I, as I said before. And on the last day of the war, 2 days before the last day of the war, he had been involved in a gas attack. And he was in a hospital in Arras in Belgium. And when he heard that the Germans had surrendered, he was upset. And he says, I am dedicating my life to politics. These people are November criminals. The Jews are responsible for this. I used to teach a Holocaust class at Delgado. I couldn't get enough students to take it here. That's why they told me, I wouldn't be able to take it here. But it was very interesting. And his hatred of the Jews stemmed from, people speculate it was from a few things, that he was actually Jewish himself, and he was what was known as a self-deprecating Jew, or he hated Jews himself. But there are a lot of theories as to why he didn't like Jews, but for, lack of a better term, self-hatred. But he decided that he was going to dedicate his life to politics. And when he did that, he joined a party. Let me give you the background. 1919, he returns to Germany. He's a corporal, decorated soldier, and he's made an investigator to go into some of these other groups that were trying to take Germany over at the time and infiltrate them and find out what they were about. Well, one of the groups he went to see were the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which was Nazi for short. And he eventually became the leader of the Nazi Party through that first visit. And he started to spout how the Jews were parasites and how they came into particular civilizations and they rotted them out from the inside. And basically what he did was he was a firm believer in what was called the big lie. And what is the big lie? The big lie is you tell a lie so big and you tell it so often that people tend to start believing it. Sound familiar? So it is just one thing that when you look at Germany at that time, they were ripe for a revolution. And he saw that, and he took advantage of that. But Adolf Hitler, like I said, was a German soldier in World War I, and he did very well. He was very brave in combat. This is the decadence of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was a democracy that arose after the Treaty of Versailles in Germany, but they were very decadent. Now, what do I mean by decadent? Prostitution was rampant. A lot of other deviations, that's all I'm going to put it that way, were out in the open. Prostitution, homosexuality. They had what they had cabarets where women used to go and dance. They had, gay nightclubs and things of that nature. So that was considered decadent back then. I know for a fact there were 3 serial killers that operated because of that decadence back then. Fritz Harman, Peter Kürten, Karl Denke was another one. And they were just brutal. They were very deviant. They were very brutal. And they actually preyed upon people that were in these parts of a decadent society that was in the Weimar Republic in Germany. The Weimar Republic was Germany at that time. So this is just a cartoon that talks about the decadence of the Weimar Republic. And what happens is when the Treaty of Versailles is signed and it's ratified by other countries other than the United States, France believes that they're very safe. And what they did was they built something called the Maginot Line, and it was named after a guy named André Maginot, who was a soldier at one of the bloodiest battles in World War I, called the Battle of Verdun. Each side lost, together they lost over 1.5 million men that was killed or wounded, which was a waste. And they built these ring of forts around France right here, so that if Germany came through Luxembourg, they would not attack France if they honored Belgian neutrality. Well, they didn't honor Belgian neutrality. And when they invaded France in 1940, they just ran over them in what was known as a blitzkrieg, which was a lightning war. But they the French built this Maginot Line, and it gave them a false sense of security, because what the Germans did was, instead of going through it, they went around it right here. And they went into France in 6 weeks. They took France over in 6 weeks. The bottom half of France was known as Vichy France, and those were collaborators with the Germans. But the northern half of France was where the Nazi Party occupied Germany. Now, this is one of the forts on the Maginot Line. I've always wanted to go to Europe to see the World War I battlefields, and especially the Maginot Line, just to take a look at it. The things I've been reading about my whole life. I probably won't ever get to see it now, but always wanted to go there and look at these battlefields and walk in the steps of the other soldiers. But anyway, so France had this false sense of security because they built the Maginot Line after World War I. And this is exactly what the German advance did in World War II. If you look at this map, all the orange arrows, they went into Belgium. They violated Belgian neutrality. Now, when I was in graduate school, I interviewed a young lady. She was in her 80s at the time, who was what was known as a hidden child. And what is a hidden child? She was hidden by a Catholic family. She was Jewish. She was hidden by a Catholic family from the Germans for 3 years. She couldn't go outside. She couldn't go near a window. She had to go to the bathroom in the sink because she couldn't go outside to use the outhouse, because every day the Germans would march through Belgium at 12 o'clock every day because it was a show of force. Her father died in Auschwitz. Her mother escaped, her brother and her sister. So there was 4 from the family that escaped and later made it to the United States. And she became a citizen. Her first name was Janine, and her last name was Rafalovitz. But it was another name I really can't tell you right now. And I interviewed her for a paper in college, and it really, the professors really liked it, because I got to actually talk to somebody who not only lost somebody in the concentration camps, but was part of that hiding culture to keep children away from the Nazis. But anyway, so they came through Belgium, and they broke Belgian neutrality, and there were some international agreements that were signed after the war. The Locarno Act of 1925 was between France, Germany, Great Britain, and Italy, and it recognized the existing frontiers after the war was over of their countries. It established a demilitarized zone 30 miles deep on the east bank of the Rhine River. Now, another thing that the Germans had to do was they had to accept Allied occupation until the reparations were paid. They were to refrain from aggression against each other. Now, what does oil have to do with all this? Well, Hitler, when he first developed his battle plan, there were some oil fields in Poland called Ploesti. And he knew he had to gain control of those oil fields if he was going to have enough fuel for his war machine. And so on September 1st, 1939, he invades Poland. Okay? But while they're making all these agreements, they understand the importance of petroleum. Okay? This reflects all the way through all of this. Okay? Because now, as you saw in the last lecture before the test, oil played a significant part in everybody's lives, still does. The Kellogg-Briand Act of 1928 makes war illegal as a tool of diplomacy. But there were no enforcement provisions. It just made it illegal. Well, if you make it illegal and you can't enforce it, then it's no good. You know, that's what I mean by the League of Nations could not support anything. They couldn't back up anything. In 1929, the stock market crashes, and we experience a depression around the world. The greatest depression that we had ever experienced. Record unemployment, record poverty, people lost their jobs, and that comes from, and more specifically, I speak about the United States. The United States was very prosperous after World War I. And women had approached what was known as a sexual revolution. We don't have any females in here. Okay. A sexual revolution where the skirts started getting higher. There were more divorces in the 1920s because women didn't want to marry just for money anymore. They wanted to marry for love and any type of physical satisfaction that they may get. And people made a lot of money. So what they started doing was they started investing in the stock market. Well, back then, there was no such thing as insider trading. If you went to a stockbroker and the stockbroker suggested, hey, I think you ought to buy this stock, it looks real good. See, they can't do that anymore. They can't do it. They can't, you need to put your money in here because they're getting ready to sell the company, or you need to sell your stock because they're getting ready to get rid of the company. Can't do that anymore. Well, back in the 20s, they did it. And people, their life savings were in the stock market. And when they lost their life savings as a result of the Great Depression, they lost everything. And banks began to close, because what happens is one bank closes and people go, well, my money's in the other bank. They run to that other bank. They take out the money. Well, how do banks make money? They make money by loaning out the money you put in it, which is, I think that system's about to change as well. So the Great Depression sets on about 1930, right after. The government did a few things that kind of stalled it but didn't stop it. And then by 1932, we were in full-fledged depression, and jobs were hard to come by. Divorces were going high. People abandoned their families. My grandfather was born in 1905, and he was, 27? Yeah, 27 at the time of the Great Depression, and he lucked out. He worked as a bookkeeper for a collection agency, and they never ran out of work during the Great Depression. In fact, that collection agency wound up with a lot of property, And this is a man who only had a ninth grade education, but man, he was a whiz with numbers. And wound up being a tax collector for the city of New Orleans, where he retired in the 70s, I think. But anyway, so you have all this unemployment and people are looking for jobs. Well, that's all over the world. And in Germany, they were suffering from a bad inflation. You needed a whole wheelbarrow full of money in order to buy a loaf of bread. If you had a job, you had to cash your check on payday that morning, because by the afternoon it wouldn't be worth that much. So it was bad. Inflation is bad. Now, if you don't understand inflation, I'll explain it very quickly, okay? Say like, this is my cell phone, okay? My cell phone is $150 million worth of gold, right? I print $150 million worth of money in paper money. This money is worth exactly $150 million, all right? Because this gold is backing up the purchase price of this money. Now, what if instead I take 150 million, I printed 150 million, and I add, this is hand sanitizer, by the way, and I add another 150 million. So we got $300 million worth of paper money and only 150 million worth of gold to back it up. This money went down in value half, okay? Well, if you print more than that, then your money's going to go down even further in value, and that's what they did in Germany at the time. Excuse me. So let me get some water. So you could bring a wheelbarrow to the I mean, there's pictures of children in Germany burning money, $100 Deutschmarks. So in the United States, it wasn't any better, because there wasn't anything there weren't any jobs to be had. There weren't, people were losing their jobs. The government, somebody thought the government was going to fail, but now we have safeguards in there where it doesn't. Okay, not unless there's some sort of wholesale takeover, some coup. My nose itches. Anyway, so the Japanese, let me go back a little bit. After the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese, they walk out of the Treaty of Versailles. That's strike one, okay, because then the world doesn't consider them to be equal to whites. Then in 1922, there's a naval conference in Washington where Japan is invited to this naval conference. And Japan is told that they cannot build as many capital ships, like battleships and aircraft carriers, as the United States, France, or Great Britain. You're going, wait a minute. I can build as many ships. No, you can't. So that was strike two. There's about 5 strikes. 1925, a new emperor comes to the throne. His name is Hirohito. And he puts in charge a prime minister by the name of Hideki Tojo. And Hideki Tojo says, they wouldn't let us put this resolution into the Versailles Treaty. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start taking over countries in Asia, and we're going to bring them into the Japanese Empire. And this was a term called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. One of their first invasions had to do with Manchuria, which is right across the China Sea from Japan. So it's not that far. And they renamed it Manchukuo. Well, when they named it Manchukuo, they demanded everybody learn how to speak Japanese. This was 1931. Well, they told Japan, don't do that. And in 1933, Japan said, screw you, we're going to do what we want. And they walked out of the League of Nations. So they left the League of Nations. By 1933, we already had a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, he's trying to get the country out of the Depression. He's not really, he's concerned with foreign policy, but it hasn't really touched America yet, because we said we're not going to get involved in any foreign entanglements after this. So what happens is Japan starts taking over oil reserves and raw materials from these countries that they keep overrunning, and they're going into the Pacific Islands, which the United States has had a stake in since the Spanish-American War of 1898. In 1937, the Japanese invade a province in China called Nanking, and they went crazy. They committed a lot of atrocities in Nanking in 1937, and basically what they did was they went in there and they sexually abused every female child from 8 to 80. They used people humans for both bullet target practice and samurai sword target practice. And the only refuge that these people could find was the German embassy in Nanking, which was run by the Nazis by this time, because the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933 under Adolf Hitler. He was the chancellor of Germany, and then in 1934, the president, Hindenburg, died, and Hitler becomes Der Führer, which means one leader. Well, the Japanese they're boundless. They don't have any restrictions. They're not a member of the League of Nations. People are looking at them going, God, they're such an aggressor. And they were, because they were trying to get into Burma and India and get at the rubber plantations and some of the petroleum wells that they had there, to get control of that. And by 1937, Franklin Delano Roosevelt puts an embargo on Japan that literally by 1941 is strangling the Japanese. Not only is he keeping their supply of raw materials from getting to them and petroleum from getting to them, he's also hitting them with food. So Japan says, we got to get United States off our back. How do we do it? And I'm going to leave it there until we get to that point. Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. They break all kinds of treaties, and Italy in 1922 is taken over by a guy named Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler loved this guy. He was part of, known as the Fasci, which is fascist, which was basically trying to return to the days of the Roman Empire. But Mussolini made a deal with the Catholic Church, and he became the dictator of Italy. He was known as Il Duce. And he wanted to prove to the rest of the world, 13 years after he took power, that he was a conqueror. So he goes into this itty-bitty nation called Ethiopia. It was run by a guy named Haile Selassie, and takes over Ethiopia. Do you know what's in Ethiopia? Sand. That's it. Sand. Okay? Nothing grows out there. So it was kind of an empty victory, basically. But, Mussolini kind of flexed his muscles a little bit, and he said, I invaded another country. I am a dictator. Let me go back a little bit, because this one's going a little bit quick. So what you have is you have a new prime minister in Japan, Hideki Tojo. You have the Nazis coming to power in 1933, and then you have the fascists coming to power in Italy. Well, the one thing that Hitler does is he isolates other political parties like the communists. He says, either you join the Nazi party or we're going to kill you, is basically what it was. They outlawed handguns. They outlawed personal weapons. They took over healthcare. They limited free speech. You had no free speech at all. And if it sounds familiar, it is. So Germany is leading this effort. They are, steadily Adolf Hitler starts to become a little bit more powerful than Mussolini. People start to respect him. So what occurs is people are getting scared, because France thought through the Treaty of Versailles that they were going to limit the German rise to power. Now they have to worry about Italy and Japan. Well, the biggest enemy to Adolf Hitler could have been The Russians, who went through a revolution in 1917 and became communists. They were known as the United Soviet Socialist Republics. And it was communist. And what Stalin did before World War II, now, one of the things I need to mention, if you take me in world history too, we talk about absolutist monarchs. These are people that don't answer to anybody. They have absolute power. Well, they become paranoid because they think everybody's trying to kill them to take over their power. Stalin was no different. Hitler was no different. Mussolini was no different. Stalin executed his whole officer corps, the guys that lead the military, before the war. Killed over 33,000 people. So when World War II starts and Germany invades Russia in June of 1941, he has no leadership whatsoever. They have to promote sergeants and corporals to ranks of captain and colonel in order to get some sort of leadership in there to stop the Germans from overrunning Russia. Well, we have these powers that are there. In the United States, they're starting to become very concerned about the rise of the Nazi Party and what Japan's doing, their movement in the East, and what Italy's doing. Ethiopia was the only country they really invaded. Mussolini was never going to bring them back to the Roman Empire days. But there was this organization that was started in the United States called the American First Committee, and it was headed by Charles Lindbergh. Now, you may know Charles Lindbergh as the first man to cross the Atlantic alone in a solo flight in a plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. His son was also kidnapped and killed in 1932. But here's the kicker. Lindbergh was a supporter of the Nazi Party and a supporter of Hitler and anything German, you see. So he's in America saying America first. Well, no, you're saying Germany comes first. And he visited Germany several times. Frankly, I think the man was a traitor. I don't care if he crossed the Atlantic Ocean. He was a traitor. He believed in eugenics, that one of the things that the Nazis believed in, which was what you do is you breed unwanted traits out of a particular race. Well, if you don't, you can't do it, you kill them. I mean, that's just how the Nazis were, and that's how eugenics worked. But Charles Lindbergh was the head of this America First Committee and wanted to get involved in World War II on Germany's side, clandestinely. In 1936, Mussolini and Adolf Hitler signed the Rome-Berlin Axis. So now you have two of the biggest dictators on the planet. They make this pact. It's called the Pact of Steel. Well, Adolf Hitler is just marching across Germany. He's marching across Europe. He's saying my people need what's called Lebensraum, which is living space. And how he did it was he used to go to different countries and see how many German-speaking people there were in that country. And then he said, well, wait a minute. Those people need to be included into the Reich, and he'd go and invade the country. That's what happened with the Anschluss in Austria in 1938. You know, we have ethnic Germans living there. We want to bring them in. He did that with Czechoslovakia as well. Poland, different story. He just invaded Poland and started World War II. But that was the ideal. He believed in the Superman, the Aryan, blonde hair, blue eyes, 6'2", perfect in every way. Well, Adolf Hitler was 5'4", brown hair, some say brown eyes, some say blue eyes, and was flatulent. He had gas all the time because he was a vegetarian, you see. By the time he actually killed himself, allegedly, I think he was just one sick puppy. Of course, he was a sick puppy before, you know, if you want to wipe out a whole race of people. But this was the agreement that they came to in 1936. Now, the history of oil presentation on World War II is going to cover a lot of this as well. So you're probably going to get bombarded with it doubly from it. In 1936, there was the Spanish Civil War in Spain, which became a military proving ground for the Nazis and anybody else. There were two sides. There were the nationalists, and there was the Republican, the Popular Front, which were Republicans. They were more anarchist, syndicalist, Basques, communist, Marxist, Republican, socialists. The nationalists were ultra-Catholic monarchists. They wanted the monarchy back. They were in favor of the Catholic Church, in favor of the Falange, the fascist party. And they, like I said, they were monarchists. They wanted the monarchy back, but they lost to the, I believe they lost to the Republicans. And there were a lot of Americans that went there. Now, what's important about this is that Germany and Russia and Italy used this war, this civil war, for a proving ground for their weapons. Their new weapons, the dive bombers, the machine guns, the artillery, things of that nature. So that was important. And Adolf Hitler supported Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who was the head of the Republicans. But this war went on for 3 years. And this is basically showing you it's a propaganda poster for the Spanish Civil War. And what happens is, if you look at this map, there's, it shows you a lot of military uprisings, and it's a motion map, so it shows you the nationalists took over, and in December 1930, by the end of the war, the nationalists took over. Franco was a nationalist. I'm sorry, but anyway, this is what's known as the Lincoln League. These were Americans who were communists that went over there and fought against the nationalists. A lot of them died over there. And this is Francisco Franco, who was the leader of I believe the nationalists. And he got a lot of support from Adolf Hitler. These are Italian troops in Madrid. There were troops from different countries. A lot of the South American countries supported Nazi Germany. That's why if you look a lot of the armies like Bolivia, they had the same type of helmets the Germans had. They call them the what are they called? Sturmstiel, I think it's called. It's the helmet that goes over the cap of the skull and then it flares out a little bit. That was designed to protect people from artillery shrapnel. Very effective helmet. Pablo Picasso was an artist in Spain at the time, and he drew this. He's more of an abstract type of painter. Then we get to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1937. These are some of the more mild pictures that came out of that war, out of that invasion. You see here that there are some heads that were stacked up and body parts cut. They used them for bayonet practice and for target practice with the samurai swords. The problem with this is there wasn't that much of an outrage at the time, and after the war was over, there were no war criminals tried for those atrocities. There was a book written by a lady by the name of Iris Chang. It was called The Rape of Nanking. It was a great book. I took a World War II course when I was in graduate school at UNO, and it was with Dr. Stephen Ambrose before his death, obviously, and Dr. Gunther Bischoff, and we had to read that book, The Rape of Nanking. And 2 years after I graduated from graduate school, Iris Chang, who wrote the book, killed herself. She was so overwhelmed by what the Japanese had done to her people, and nobody got charged with it, and it continued to happen. The Austrian Anschluss in 1938 was when Hitler went to Austria and said, okay, you got a lot of ethnic Germans here. I want them in the Reich. I want them in my Third Reich. They need to come and join the Third Reich, and we're going to do it by a plebiscite, which means we're going to have the people vote on it. Well, it's a rigged election. And so Austria, which Adolf Hitler, that's where he was born. He was not German. He was born in Austria and lived there. He was not German, but then he becomes the German chancellor, okay? Which, number one, was illegal because he was not a native-born citizen of Germany. The Anschluss took place in 1938, and the Austrians were welcomed into the German Reich. Adolf Hitler during this time, starting in 1936, started to do this type of takeover of nearby territory. And he said there was the problem of the Sudetenland, where he claimed that ethnic Germans were being discriminated against by Slovakians and Moravians and Bohemians. And this was right around, Prague in Bohemia. So he decided that he was going to go take over the Sudetenland, but they had more ethnic Germans there than anything. So it was kind of like going in his backyard. So they let him do that in 1938. Well, in 1938, France and Great Britain start to get worried, and they want a peace conference or a peace talk with Adolf Hitler. They want him to make an agreement. And they make an agreement, and it was called Now We Have Peace in Our Time. Herr Hitler has decided he's not going to invade any more countries. He's not going to make any more territorial demands. And they get him to sign this paper, and that's the paper that you see Neville Chamberlain holding up. But this is what is known as, and you might want to write this down, the principle of appeasement. Britain and France stated that they were going to allow Adolf Hitler to keep the countries that he already invaded if he promised not to invade another country. And he went, "Oh, I promise not to." They went, "Okay." And they went home. 2 years later, or a year later, we're looking at him invading Poland and then invading France and Denmark and all these other countries. So appeasement doesn't work, because it's kind of like that old adage, you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And that's what appeasement did. And Neville Chamberlain, when Adolf Hitler finally decided to start World War II, he looked so weak. And the British people actually got rid of him. Czechoslovakia becomes part of the Third Reich in 1939. And then Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with Russia. Because once he invades France and he's got a foothold to go ahead and invade Britain, he was going to turn east and invade Russia. Well, come to find out, he reneged on this agreement too. But von Ribbentrop and Molotov. Von Ribbentrop was the German foreign minister, and Molotov, which is where the Molotov cocktail came from, signed this agreement that they wouldn't invade each other, but Hitler reneges on it. Okay? Now, where is the United States in all of this? The United States is still trying to get out of the Great Depression. In 1937, there were some Japanese planes that attacked a patrol boat, Navy patrol boat, on the Yangtze River and killed a few sailors, but we didn't go to war over that. Kind of looked at it as a diplomatic misunderstanding. I don't see how you can have a misunderstanding when people are killed, but that's what happened. We're keeping an eye on Japan. Time magazine's Man of the Year for 1939 was Adolf Hitler. So people are starting to respect him, but he makes a mistake. And that mistake is his anti-Semitism. And he invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. And he decides that, the world is mine. I'm going to take it, whether you give it to me or not. After the Battle of Britain in 1940, he stopped in France. He didn't go any further. But in Russia, he turned toward Russia after the Battle of Britain in 1940. And he said, "I'm going to invade Russia, and I'm going to kill those communist people. I'm going to get them out of my hair. They're no longer going to be a threat." And he turns toward, but the problem that Adolf Hitler made, the mistake that he made, was that he attacked Russia right before the winter began. Russian winters can be brutal. Sometimes temperatures 50 below zero. And the armies marched far. They thinned out. Eventually, there was a surrender at Stalingrad in 1942, 42. And his army was basically defeated and began the slow march back home. And then the Soviet Union started to come in from the east. But anyway, the war begins on September 1st, 1939, and Poland is a big asset because, like I said, Poland has the petroleum fields at Ploesti. There's also some fields or some petroleum in North Africa. So Hitler launches a campaign into North Africa. And that's where they get a lot of the fuel there, from North Africa. So he attacks Poland in 1939. They had strategic reserves. Troops march into Warsaw, and immediately they start rounding up Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and political prisoners and start putting them into concentration camps. Now, what's a concentration camp? Let me dispel this myth for you. There's a difference between a concentration camp and a death camp. Concentration camp is used to keep large concentrations of people in it. A death camp is they go there specifically for the purpose to be killed, or they're sent there to be killed. Auschwitz, Birkenau was a death camp. Buchenwald was a death camp. Sobibor, I believe Sobibor. Chelmno was a death camp in Eastern Europe. And so they start shipping people from all over the Third Reich, Germany, Italy, France. Poland had a lot of Jews anyway. And what the Germans did was they locked them in what was known as the Warsaw Ghetto, and it was like 5 square blocks, and people weren't getting fed, and people were dying, and the Germans didn't care, and there was an uprising, and the Germans put it down. They crushed it and sent all the survivors to Auschwitz, for the good of the Reich. That's basically what the Germans believed in, was for the good of the Reich. In 1940, Rome, Italy, and Germany, and Japan signed what's known as the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis, the Tripartite Act in 1940. Well, what this does is it pools all their petroleum resources, so they don't have to depend on other things to bring in petrol. Look, Army marches on fuel and their stomach. All right, you got to have fuel if you're going to conduct a war, and they knew this. Well, this was prior to the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. By 1940, Adolf Hitler had already attacked France, was going to take over France in 6 weeks. He was getting ready to launch what was known as the Battle of Britain because he wanted to invade Britain at the time. That didn't work. He didn't count on the resiliency of the British people. And he hadn't yet turned his sights toward Russia, or Soviet Union. Back then it was known as Soviet Union. But he did look to the Middle East, in North Africa, in the European, what they call ETO, European Theater of Operations. That's Europe, okay? Who were the Allied powers and who were the Axis powers? Who were, Adolf Hitler and Japan and Italy, and the neutral powers in Europe. Switzerland was a neutral power. Spain and Portugal, they said, we're sitting this one out. Okay, so it was up to everybody else in order to defeat Germany. And let me tell you something, the war was not going well in the first few months. It didn't stabilize until about 1941, when the United States finally decided to enter the war on the 10th of December 1941, after Pearl Harbor. So when you're dealing with two separate, there's the Pacific Theater of Operations, where the United States was fighting the Japanese, and the European Theater of Operations, where the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia were fighting the Germans in the European theater. The Italians to some extent too, but a lot of people didn't like Mussolini, and when he was overthrown, they just said, heck with him. There was a phony war in the spring of 1940. Now that means that, after the invasion of Poland and that settled down, there was no military actions for a long time in Europe. That's why they call it the phony war. It was a cold war. It wasn't really a hot one. And then on June 4th, 1940, the Germans decide to invade Dunkirk, which was a British outpost in France, and it fell, and they had to get all these private ships to come in there to take their troops out of there, or else they were going to be slaughtered by the Germans. In June of 1940, also, France surrenders. Now, I explained to you that the northern part of France was occupied by the Germans. The southern part was what was known as Vichy France, which was a collaborative government, which means they were with the Germans. They did everything the Germans told them to do, but they were ruled by French people. The leader of that was a guy by the name of Henri Pétain. Now, Henri Pétain was a hero of World War I. After the defeat of the Germans, he was the commander at Verdun, this big battle that they had. And he was known as a great commander, but he turned collaborator. After the war, he'd be tried and sentenced to prison, but he wouldn't be executed because he did garner a lot of respect from the French people for what he did at Verdun. Vichy France, Henri Pétain, as I explained before. And then there was Free France, which was headed by General Charles de Gaulle. And they had a group of resistance called the Maquis, which were the French resistance, which fought against the Germans in the occupied territories. They were very successful. They were very brave people. They were patriots. They just wanted the Germans gone. So if you notice, the typical French flag is the tricolor, the blue, the white, and the red. This was a cross of freedom that they put in the middle to signify the free French. Okay, so this ends part 1. I'm going to conclude part 2 next Wednesday at 1 o'clock. And I'm going to put... I'm not going to put the PowerPoint up there until both parts are done because it takes too long to split it up. But you can review that, and if I come up with some articles about the start of World War II, I want to incorporate the oil aspect into it because it was very important. We won't have a test for about another week because I want to get this information covered before then. So I appreciate everybody showing up, and I will put a link to the video under announcements or the other emails so that you'll have it. That way you can go back and look at it, hold on to it in your announcements, and see if I find any articles. But that's it for this week. I will see you next Wednesday at 1 o'clock, where we'll try to get through this. Probably won't be another test for another 2 weeks. Maybe we can get through all of this and make it worth 2 test grades. Excuse me, since it's going to be a lot of material. So thanks everyone for being here, and I will see you next Wednesday at 1 o'clock.